So I was cut off as I was talking about the results of the 1912 election. Remember that Wilson won this election. And then the overwhelming support for the progressive presidential candidates ensured that their reform efforts would continue under Wilson. So even though the Progressive Party failed to elect local candidates and a president, it suggested the idea that reform was still in the minds of Americans, even though the new Progressive Party would probably not last. The ideas contained in Roosevelt's new nationalism of strong federal government regulations helping the people would have a lasting influence for most of the century. Wilson, who grew up in Virginia during the Civil War, was only the second Democrat elected president since the war. Cleveland was the other. He was also the first Southerner to occupy the White House since Zachary Taylor back in the 1840s. Wilson was idealistic, intellectual, righteous, and inflexible. Like Roosevelt, he believed that a president should actively lead Congress, and as necessary, appeal directly to the people to rally support for his legislative program. In his inaugural address in 1913, the Democratic president pledged again his commitment to a new freedom. To bring back conditions of free and fair competition in the economy, Wilson attacked what he called the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, banking, and trusts. So Wilson wasted no time to fulfill his campaign pledges. On the first day of his presidency, he called a special session of Congress to lower the tariff. Past presidents had always sent written messages to Congress, but Wilson broke this long-standing tradition by addressing Congress in person about the need for lower tariff rates to bring consumer prices down. Passage of the Underwood Tariff in 1913 substantially lowered tariffs for the first time in over 50 years. To compensate for the reduced tariff revenues, the Underwood Bill included a graduated income tax with rates from 1 to 6%. Wilson's next major initiative concerned the banking system and the money supply. He was persuaded that the gold standard was inflexible and that banks, rather than serving the public interest, were too much influenced by stock speculators on Wall Street. The president again went directly to Congress in 1913 to propose a plan for building both stability and flexibility into the U.S. financial system. Rejecting the Republican proposal for a private national bank, he proposed a national banking system with 12 district banks supervised by a Federal Reserve Board. After months of debate, Congress finally passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1914. Ever since, Americans have purchased goods and services using the Federal Reserve notes, dollar bills, issued by the federally regulated banking system. Two major pieces of legislation in 1914 completed Wilson's New Freedom program. One was the Clayton Antitrust Act. This act strengthened the provisions in the Sherman Antitrust Act for breaking up monopolies. Most important for organized labor, the new law contained a clause exempting unions from being prosecuted as trusts. The new regulatory agency, called the Federal Trade Commission, was empowered to investigate and take action against any unfair trade practice in every industry except banking and transportation. Wilson was at first opposed to any legislation that seemed to favor special interests, such as farmers' groups and labor unions. He was finally persuaded, however, to extend his reform program to include federal farm loans. In 1916, he extended 12 regional federal farm loans because they were designed to provide farm loans at low interest rates. Wilson also supported the Child Labor Act. This measure, which was long favored by settlement house workers and labor unions alike, was enacted in 1916. It prohibited the shipment and interstate commerce of products that were manufactured by children under 14 years old. In championing greater democracy for the American people, most leaders of the progressive movement thought only in terms of the white race. African Americans were for the most part ignored by progressive presidents and governors. President Wilson had a strong Southern heritage, and many of the racist attitudes of the times. But he acquiesced to the demands of Southern Democrats and permitted the segregation of federal workers in buildings. The status of African Americans had declined steadily since Reconstruction. With the Supreme Court's separate but equal decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, racial segregation had been the rule in the South and unofficially in much of the North. Ironically and tragically, the Progressive era coincided with years when thousands of blacks were lynched by racist mobs. Few progressives did anything about segregation and lynching. Most shared in the practice of general prejudice of their times. In addition, many considered other reforms, such as lower tariffs, to be more important than anti-lynching laws, because such reforms as lower tariffs benefited everyone rather than just one group. Though lacking widespread white support, African Americans took action to alleviate poverty and discrimination. Economic deprivation and exploitation was one problem. Denial of civil rights was another. Which problem was primary was a difficult question that had become the focus of a debate between two African American leaders, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. The most influential African American at the turn of the century was Booker T. Washington, the head of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. In his Atlanta Exposition speech in 1895, Washington argued that blacks' needs for education and economic progress were of foremost importance, and that they should concentrate on learning industrial skills for better wages. Only after establishing a secure economic base, said Washington, could African Americans hope to realize their other goal of political and social equality. Unlike Washington, who had been born into slavery on a southern plantation, W.E.B. Du Bois was a northerner with a college education. He became a distinguished scholar and writer. He wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, in which he criticized Booker T. Washington's approach. Du Bois demanded equal rights for African Americans. He argued that political and social rights were a prerequisite for economic independence. Washington's pragmatic approach to economic advancement and Du Bois' militant demands for equal rights framed the debate for African Americans to having more civil rights that would continue throughout much of the 20th century. At the close of the 19th century, about 9 out of 10 African Americans lived in the South. In the next century, this ratio steadily shifted toward the North. This internal migration began in earnest between 1910 and 1930, when about 1 million people traveled north to seek jobs in the cities. Motivating their decision to leave the South were the deteriorating race relations, the destruction of cotton crops by the boll weevil, and also the new job opportunities in northern factories that opened up when white workers were drafted in World War I. The Great Depression in the 1930s slowed migration, but World War II renewed it. Between 1940 and 1970, over 4 million African Americans moved north. Although many succeeded in improving their economic conditions, the newcomers to northern cities also faced racial tension and discrimination. The Progressive Era was a time of increased activism and optimism for a new generation of feminists. By 1900, the older generation of suffrage crusaders, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had passed the torch to younger women. They sought allies among male progressives, but not always with success. For example, President Wilson refused to support the suffragists' call for a national amendment until late in his presidency. Carrie Chapman Catt, an energetic reformer from Iowa, became the new president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1900. Catt argued for the vote as a broadening of democracy which would empower women, thus enabling them to more actively care for their families in an industrial society. At first, Catt continued NAWSA's drive to win votes for women at the state level before changing strategies and seeking a suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A more militant approach to gaining the vote was adopted by some women. These women took to the streets with mass pickets, parades, and hunger strikes. Their leader was Alice Paul of New Jersey. She broke from the NAWSA in 1916 to form the National Women's Party. From the beginning, Paul focused on winning the support of Congress and the President for an amendment to the Constitution. The dedicated efforts of women on the home front in World War I finally persuaded a two-thirds majority in Congress to support a women's suffrage amendment. Its ratification as the 19th Amendment in 1920 guaranteed women's right to vote in all elections at the local, state, and national levels. Following the victory of her cause, Carrie Chapman Catt organized the League of Women Voters, a civic organization dedicated to keeping voters informed about candidates and issues. In addition to winning the right to vote, progressive women worked on other issues as well. Margaret Sanger advocated birth control education, especially among the poor. Over time, the movement developed into the Planned Parenthood organization. Women made progress in securing educational equality, liberalizing marriage and divorce laws, reducing discrimination in business and the professions, and recognizing women's right to own property.